There was a company very locally sitting out of a particular region in India. They were looking at trainings in English and the same trainings that were probably given to somebody in the United States. They did not understand what the person was saying. They did not understand what FCPA is. If you're not an MNC or if you're not a large company or a market leader and you're trying to follow a decentralized approach, you're setting up yourself failure. But what we have seen is that a hybrid compliance structure is the sweet spot for most MNCs. Communication which has to go to a global chief compliance officer, for instance, that's not going to happen if you do not have the buy-in. Compliance functions do need to be a little flexible. There's no need to always be rigid from what we see.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox. Welcome to the award-winning FCPA Compliance Report, the oldest podcast in compliance. If you haven't done so, I hope you will check out my latest podcast, AI Today in 5, where I look at 5 top AI and compliance stories. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, and we're back for another episode, and you're in for a treat today. And as always, the reason is because I'm in for a treat. I have with me Suhail Motwani from FTI Consulting, and we're going to talk about an article he and his colleague wrote that I guess came across in their newsletter, and it's called Navigating the Compliance Paradox. And I thought it was great, and I reached out and asked him if he would talk on the podcast about it, and he graciously agreed to do so. So, with that incredibly long-winded introduction, first of all, Suhail, welcome to the podcast, and thank you so much for taking the time to visit with me today.
Thanks so much for having me on, Tom. Pleasure to be here. Given the amount of quantum of content that you've already produced on corporate compliance, I'm quite happy that we found a topic that can add value to the audience.
Suhail, could you tell us about your professional background and your current role?
So I'm currently a senior director with FTI Consulting, part of the risk advisory and investigations practice based out of Mumbai, India. I often refer to myself as a problem solver for problem solvers because when a crisis hits any organization, it's the chief compliance officer, general counsel, or external legal counsel who have been retained, where the whole organization, senior business leaders, etc., turn to solve problems, and they in turn work with us to resolve whatever issues it might be. So that's the best way to describe my current role. Of course, we do significant work in India, Southeast Asia, and globally for proactive investigations, compliance reviews, etc. And look, I have been quite fortunate because I started my career in this field with a Big Four previously, more than a decade ago now. And very early on, I had the opportunity to sit down with some compliance leaders and pick their brains, understand their decision-making process, how they think about compliance and how it's evolving over time. So I think that put me in a great place very early on, and I've been using all of those learnings to advise our clients over the last all this time.
Suhail, one thing I don't think I'm very good at is titles. So I always appreciate when I see a great title. And I'm going to reread the title of your article because I just thought it was fabulous. And the title is, I'm going to read the full title, Navigating the Compliance Paradox, Balancing Global Oversight with Local Adaptation. I've been in this field 20 years and we're still struggling with that. But could I ask you to define the paradox as you see it?
You know what, to be honest, this is not an article that came over, it's not something we wrote overnight. I think for the last 6 to 7 years, every time we undertake an investigation for a multinational specifically, operating in India or Southeast Asia, I have started seeing a trend of, there is some kind of extremity which is there, where either there is too much centralization, which is sometimes overbearing, and it's misaligned with the local business. And because of that, people don't follow it, or they just don't tend to do it. And at other times, there is so much autonomy given that either just the basic requirements are done just to meet the local statutory compliances, or they just don't do it because they are the decision makers and they need to focus on their business and numbers, which is natural. So this is where the whole topic started, because we started seeing that trend. And unfortunately, I don't think there's a statistic for this. It's more about our observations. But effectively, the paradox comes down to two things, right? How much uniformity do we want, and how much adaptability do we want at the same time?
So, what are some of the key considerations in the framework that you all have come up with to think through this issue?
I'll be honest with you, it's not rocket science. Um, what it's any competent risk manager would look at the same elements, I would say. The only difference what we've done here is we've gone to the nuance of looking at a compliance structure per se, or how it impacts a compliance structure. Because anytime you do a risk assessment, you do a compliance review, often the outcome is, okay, we need to develop a new policy, or we need to adjust our policy, or it is that we need to do better trainings, better communications. But how many times do we see that, okay, we are actually reassessing the way we structure a compliance framework? Do we have the correct people? Do we have the decision making in the correct place? I haven't seen that. I haven't seen at any given point an organization going far beyond the means of looking at a structure per se. Of course, I think recently resourcing was a big challenge in compliance, which is now improving. But still, I think it's only reached that level. So there's a lot of headroom over there. That being said, as I mentioned, right, it's not rocket science, not groundbreaking. We look at the same concepts you look at any risk. So you would look at the organization structure, the context of your organization. You would look at the leadership that you have. Are they ready to commit to the tone at the top? Because again, tone at the top is something that you hear in every single compliance article, any compliance podcast, so you'll probably hear tone at the top, but there's a reason for that. Without that, nothing happens. We've seen it, right? So we've actually seen real examples of it where just because there's a global audit happening at times, we've seen that, okay, the local CFO will say that let's put up the best act we can for the global auditors who are coming down to India. But then when you hear that from the CFO to your team, the team does not take it seriously. They don't take compliance seriously. They take it as an act, a temporary act to show up. But do they follow through with it? No, because that culture doesn't exist, right? It's a one-off for them. So I think tone on the top is always the most important, and that's where the whole organization structure comes into play. Aside from that, one of the key elements that we've assessed is your regulatory landscape, because how regulated is the landscape, is the industry you operate in. That has to define your structure, because you cannot, and it's not only how regulated it is, it's which regulations impact you. So is it your headquarter company's regulations that impact you more? Is it your local regulations that impact you more? So these are a few aspects. Aside from this, it's your organization's geographical footprint and your global risk profile. So for instance, you might be an organization that is operating in 20 different countries, but all of these 20 countries are developed nations. So you may not need that kind of agility because there is not that much change in regulations. Everything is working well. But at the same time, if you have 20 countries under your company, but all of them are sitting out of high risk jurisdictions, for each and every one of them, you're going to have regulation changes that happen every quarter. And how you're going to keep up with that. So all of these aspects need to be assessed. And even something as simple as M&A, right? How much do we consider an M&A activity as a compliance aspect, or something that affects your compliance structure? Now, if you're in a growth mode, specifically in an emerging market, you will need to ensure that any compliance action you take is in line with your global standards at times, but also in line with the local market. And tomorrow, when you go and purchase or invest in a new company or acquire a new company, you'll have to do the same again and again. So there's tons more factors, but we felt these are the 5-6 top factors.
I maybe started a little bit before you, 20 years ago, and 20 years ago there was an extreme push towards centralization. And then, as with many corporate initiatives, we had an evolution pushing out to a more decentralized approach. And now we've come to realize there may be elements of both that are useful. There may be elements of both that perhaps are suboptimal. But I wanted to now ask you, if you could go through the structures of both a centralized and decentralized and why a hybrid model might be something that we should really consider going forward.
I think that's a great point because while yes, I obviously started much later, but I have seen that too. I have seen that there was a big push for centralization, and then look what happened, right? So there were, if you look at most of the enforcements that happened, specifically if we take the FCPA enforcements, it was all in because of issues that happen in emerging markets, all of them, or majority of them, I would say. And that was because there was a centralized structure, because there was an expectation that okay, we are putting down the policies and the framework, so that's going to be followed. Because a centralized structure essentially drives that okay, it's a top-down approach. It's completely uniform policies. It's uniformity in your trainings and your communications, and there is very little room for localization over there. But we've seen significant issues that happen over there. So I'll give you an example of trainings, right? Now, there were trainings which we saw that there was a company very locally sitting out of a particular region in India. They were looking at trainings in English and the same trainings that were probably given to somebody in the United States. They did not understand what the person was saying. They did not understand in what context it was saying. They did not understand what FCPA is. They did not understand why they are being spoken about facilitation payments. They had no idea, right? So when we went in and we spoke to the head of the center. They said that look, these guys don't understand all this. You need to talk to them locally. You need to talk in the local language, and you need to give them examples and scenarios which are local. And that's what we did, and it actually helped substantially because then they understood what we are talking about. So it's a very simple example, right? Trainings, we don't give that much attention to it, right? You can just say, okay, I'm going to roll out, I'm going to hire the best trainer, best LMS company, and it's going to work perfectly. But it doesn't unless you go into that detail and localize it. So that does not happen in a centralized compliance framework, for instance. That being said, uh, it does work. It specifically works when a global company or an MNC is operating on a smaller scale, regardless of what jurisdiction. Because then, look, you need to be cost efficient also, because you probably need to balance your compliance costs across jurisdictions. So when there is a low risk business, so let's say a shared services, right? There is not that much interaction with any business over there. It's all internal services being provided. Now that's operating from an emerging market. You can take a slightly higher risk tolerance there and say that, look, here I can have a more centralized structure because I do not need that much insight. There's not that much operations that are happening there that are high risk, right? So from that point of view, it does work great. It also works great at times in a highly regulated sector, for instance. So where there are regulations sitting out of, let's say, I think the best example here is the US FDA. So there's a lot of manufacturing facilities in India where medicines are manufactured, and um, they are then sold in the United States. But uh, there are US FDA audits that keep happening. Now the local guys are not going to be able to keep up with this, is what was the initial thought. But with time, that has changed. What has happened is there have been instances that there's been so much focus on the US FDA audits that the local compliances are not looked into. So this is the paradox, right? So this is the paradox we're talking about. With every aspect you can bring it in, and we see it happening. So the whole balancing act of that is important, and which is where all the context comes in. Now, very specifically on decentralization, right, where there's complete local autonomy. I see this as twofold, right? One is where there are local compliance team members. They have been given autonomy, decision-making autonomy. They have been given responsibility to develop the framework, to maintain the framework, to monitor it, to monitor its effectiveness, and to keep modifying it. There is a more common aspect or a more common structure that we see, specifically in emerging markets, and that is where local business leaders are provided with the freedom to develop the compliance program. So the compliance officer is hired by them. They are the ones that they report into, if at all that's actually done, because that's not always done. Because if you're business leader working for a MNC, your first target is your sales. That's your primary KPI, right? So if you are also then going to control the compliance structure, it's gonna side off somewhere. So there's two ways to look at this. Now, the main thing here is that the core trait here is, as I said, decision making. The whole design, everything is local, and it works very, very well for certain type of companies. In fact, I would say there are organizations who are market leaders in their sector. So they're market leaders in, let's say, pharmaceuticals, or they're market leaders in FMCG, for instance, yeah, within the country itself. What happens with them is that they are so big that they effectively become a centralized framework itself, because they have compliance leaders. They know the reputation at stake, so they take care of everything. In fact, they go one step beyond and try imbibing global policies without the global team interfering, while the global team looks at it as this is a decentralized setup. But again, it's not, it doesn't come across clearly, right? Because they know the stakes at hand. So while we will call it a decentralized in theory, but in practicality, it's actually centralized, because that company is self-sufficient. That organization does not actually need its parent company to step in, right? Again, this is where the paradox comes in. So these are the two aspects we see. Specifically, where it doesn't work, and it doesn't work in a lot of places. So if you're not an MNC, or if you're not a large company or a market leader, and you're trying to follow a decentralized approach, you're setting up yourself for failure, is what I would say. You're opening up yourself to risk where it's not required, because owing to the smaller scale of operations, the business leaders are not going to have the time or the resources to look into this. So that's where the global team has to step in and be a little bit more forceful, is what I would say. So these are the two aspects on on centralization and decentralization type of structures. But what we have seen is that a hybrid compliance structure is the sweet spot for most MNCs, because how it's effectively structured, to simplify it, there are certain non-negotiables, right? So it's like your global anti-bribery corruption policies, your data privacy norms, your your overall framework, your risk registers, etc. The minimals, right? The non-negotiables. So that is all there, your code of conduct, etc. But there's also what I call a spectrum of flexibility. So that spectrum of flexibility is where the local compliance team comes in. One of the biggest examples of this is cultural customary gifts that are provided, right? So if you look at this as if you look at any, let's say you're doing a FCPA audit, for instance, and you look at gifts being provided in large quantities, it's a big red flag for anyone who's looking at from a global lens. But then when you come into the local context and you look at it, you realize that, look, this is customary over here, and as long as we have enough policies around it, enough documentation, we're recording it correctly, we are having the list of the recipients, and most importantly, it's at a below a certain threshold, it is fine. It is not construed as a bribe. It's a customary gift, right? But even here, even on the threshold, you cannot have the same threshold that you have in let's say a developed country, because that would be looked as a bribe in that instance. So the threshold also needs to be adjusted locally. So all of these smaller nuances, even for each and every aspect, is where the hybrid compliance works the absolute best. It gives you the perfect balance of control and flexibility, ensures that compliance is something which is sustainable and scalable along with your business. It's not prioritizing one or the other. It ensures that your business operations are in line with this. In fact, there's a hack that I see that a lot of our companies use, and a lot of our clients use, and some friends too who are in compliance. So what they do is, if they're part of the local team, they try to maintain excellent relationships with the management, because they have to. They need to work in tandem with them. That's the role today. The moment they see something untoward, they are not the bearers of the bad news. They report that to their counterparts or their managers in sitting out of the headquarters, and they are the ones who step in at that point. Which then, this kind of setup allows that allows that old story of good cop bad cop, and it actually works. It works in reality because then the local business does it opens up with the local compliance folks, because that's not going to happen when you have global compliance team members coming in for an investigation, right? So all of this, all of these aspects is where a hybrid model works the best.
I hesitate to say there's one most important thing to implementing a hybrid model, but I'm going to have to start with maybe two. And you said it right up front, tone at the top, that management has to commit to giving the local team, and I mean executive leadership team, I mean the chief compliance officer, and I'm going to talk about the country manager in a minute. All of those people have to empower the local people. But the second thing is training. How do you train a local to really have the skills to not only recognize a situation but also train their colleagues as well? Any real thoughts? Or do you see something else as more important, or really it's just a list or a category of things you really must do to have success in the hybrid model?
No, I mean, as I said, I think number one is the non-negotiables, right? So you need to have a list of that. You need to take that stand with the management, and that has to be imbibed at the tone of the top. They need to buy into that. I think that's the first aspect. Number two, before and I do agree trainings is critical, but I also see flexibility as being critical. So what happens usually is, and this is an on-ground reality, I think compliance functions do need to be a little flexible. There's no need to always be rigid from what we see. There are times where there is overly rigidness from not only from the compliance team, from the business side also, and that doesn't lead to a good working relationship in the future. So what needs to be there is, okay, what is an absolute necessity as per law, as per regulation? What do we need to follow, right? So that's high priority. Now, number two, what is my best practice? What am I trying to implement which is good to have? Do I need to do that today? Do I need to enforce that on the business today? No, but I can agree with them that over time we can implement this. Let's work toward it, because it will allow us to be more resilient in the future. It will allow us to resolve issues, or basically foresee and be prepared for new regulations that might come up. So I think that kind of communication is important with the local management. So when I see trainings, I essentially see it as a form of communication. So yes, it's the best way to communicate with a larger group, but even your communications have to be a little bit more tailor-made. They cannot be, okay, this is what we've said and this has to be followed. You need to understand the business, which is why in a hybrid setup, even training your local compliance team members on these softer aspects, that you need to be flexible, you need to hear them out, you need to actually understand their risks. See, the whole point of having someone local on the ground is so that they understand the local nuances and they understand the local business challenges that they face from business side of things. Because I don't think a global compliance person sitting out of somewhere else or the headquarters, they shouldn't need to do that, right? And they shouldn't have that expectation, unnecessary burden on them, which is where we see a lot of these issues come up. And which is why when you train the local people, you need to train them that, look, you are not just an approver. You need to get into the roots. You need to sit down with the team members and understand why they're trying to do something or why they're asking to do something.
It strikes me that, and maybe you touched on this in another way of phrasing it, but it strikes me, and one of the reasons I was so excited when I read your article, that you would create a communication stream, not simply top down or corporate headquarters to regional office, but also back the other way. And so that the compliance officer sitting in the corporate office, wherever that might be, would actually have more and better information because they have a local asset on the ground who could give them information. But even more importantly, if that local asset can win the trust of their colleagues, you're going to have a much more robust discussion. And so that information, you really untap an information source within your company to help build out your compliance program literally around the world. Would that be a fair assessment from what you've seen as well?
Exactly. So it's you're gathering intelligence, and you're doing it in the best way possible, because you're inside the system. You are speaking to people on a daily basis, and that's the job, right? So a lot of my a lot of my clients, they tell me that, look, I have to do a lot of networking. I need to do a lot of internal networking on a daily basis to ensure that I understand these people, because without that buy-in, as you rightly said, that communication which has to go to a global chief compliance officer, for instance, that's not going to happen if you do not have the buy-in. Like, if you yourself are looked out as a bad cop, essentially, uh, in those instances, nobody's going to open up to you. They're probably going to try hiding things from you also, instead of saying that, look, I want to do this. Tell me how I can do it. Help me out to do it, guide me to do it. So I think that's it's important, right? You need that. I think that's where the human element comes in. You need to be understanding, and I've seen that evolution in local compliance officers. I do think initially it wasn't that flexible. I think they themselves also saw themselves that, okay, look, I need to be put my foot down at every time, but I think that understanding aspect of it is there, and that also allows, look, when they're asking for something which is not okay at all, and which is going to be a borderline issue for you. uh, that kind of relationship and dynamic allows the person to push back.
Suhail, this has been a great podcast. I hope we can continue this conversation. This is Tom Fox again. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the award-winning FCPA Compliance Report, the oldest podcast in compliance. I hope you will subscribe, rate, and review wherever great podcasts are listened to. Also, check out some of the other great podcasts on the Compliance Podcast Network.